Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how the TRA uses your data. Thank you very much for choosing to spend part of your afternoon with us. And as you can see on your screen, we have a very interesting agenda for you. You'll be hearing from 5 experts from the TRA, from the investigations team, analysts, verification, and policy. Each of them will talk to you about how data is used in their department. I just wanted to reiterate that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube afterwards. And any questions that you have, please put them in the Q&A chat bar and we'll get to them at the end. So without further ado, I will pass on to our first speaker, which is Wei.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wei. I head up the Data and Monitoring Unit within the Trade Remedies Authority. So my role is all about making sure the organisation gets the right data for our cases, but also not just cases. It's kind of our people data, our finance data, and everything kind of to do with data for the Trade Remedies Authority. And my other role is looking after monitoring and evaluation, which is thinking about how do we undertake impact evaluation. So are our measures effective or not? So, just to give you a bit of background about why exactly we really value data at the Trade Remedies Authority. So, our mission as an organisation is to defend the UK from defend the UK economic interests against unfair international trade practices, and really underpinning that is our investigations and case and how we undertake our cases. And really, kind of when it comes to data, is that we have to use data, we have to use evidence to allow our investigations to be fair, impartial, rigorous, and efficient. And then once we make those recommendations to our Secretary of State, our Secretary of State can then make those right decisions for the country, for the stakeholders that we engage with, and within the bounds of international law from the World Trade Organization. So having worked in government and kind of public sector for over 10 years, I think working at the Trade Remedies Authority is really the first organization that I see taking data so seriously. And I've worked in other departments where we have used a lot of data, say, for example, offset, but the Trade Remedies Authority really values that and it underpins everything that we do. And it has to, right? Because we rely on you as stakeholders to provide us information for our cases. And we'll then take that information away to make those decisions, make those calculations, and investigate in a really fair, impartial way to come to those right conclusions. So within our cases, kind of like I said earlier, is that we try to make them fair, impartial, rigorous, and efficient. And how does data feed into that? Well, getting the right data at the right time allows us to be efficient with the work that we do and make those recommendations to Secretary of State on time. We're also trying to be more efficient with our time, so doing that before the WTO deadlines, and getting the right data from you as our stakeholders is really core to that. So we try to work with you from the beginning to make sure that you're providing us with the right information, right evidence, so we can start working on that as soon as possible. Getting the right data also allows us to be proportionate in our recommendations. So we want our recommendations to be targeting those injury factors, targeting the UK's economic interests. So we're not putting measures which are too high or too low. If it's in too low, obviously it does not help our producers in the UK. But if they are too high, it stifles international competition or stifles and provides inefficiencies to the UK economy. Thirdly, is that giving data from all parties, so not just from UK producers, but from our international partners as well, so from different parts of government, from the UK, and also from foreign governments, will help us make our recommendations that will help us recommendations look at all factors and from all sides. And if our recommendations then are able to look at data from all sides, it makes that recommendation at the end very much impartial. Obviously, we'll still have an element of judgment within that, but be able to see the evidence from different parties, different perspectives, and different points of views helps us make those impartial judgments at the end. And lastly, is that we really want to focus on transparency. So while we are very much using private, not private, financial sensitive information from our key stakeholders, and they will be very much sensitive in terms of financial outcomes or business related information. We want to protect that. We want to make sure that commercially sensitive data is held securely. But we also want to make sure that we are publishing information which is supporting kind of our decisions. So if we're making a decision, or if we're supporting our Secretary of State to make a decision when we're making those recommendations, being able to say, okay, this is how we've come to that conclusion is really very much important. It not only in terms of for our stakeholders to see we've come to those conclusions in a fair and logical way, but also for other people to audit, say, for example, in the future, say, actually, have we done the right things to come to that recommendation? And obviously, we want to be transparent in that way to then say, okay, yeah, you can test us, you can also basically question us, and then but we can't. But what we would like to do is make sure that we are protecting any sensitive information as well. So transparency comes with protection. So I will hand over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the importance of data as well.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just waiting for the next slide. There we go. Thank you very much. My name is Sarah Avery. I head up our technical support function, which sits within the policy team at the TRA. Now, within that is the pre-application office. The pre-application office offers support and guidance to industry who may be looking to explore bringing a brand new application, but they may also have queries around how the UK trade remedies regime works. They may be importers who are looking to ask questions around existing measures which are in place and whether or not there are any kind of reviews that could take place. So the pre-application office provides the support to industry to help them navigate the wonderful world of trade remedies in the UK. So today I'm going to talk about the importance of data and why it's needed. And as you can see from the slide, essentially it demonstrates the very fundamentals of the case right from the outset, right from putting the application together, but also all the way through the investigation itself. Now, the manner in which it demonstrates the fundamentals of the case, we're looking at whether or not there is dumping and or subsidy, whether there is injury to the UK industry, and whether that injury is caused by the dumping and or subsidy that's happening. So thinking about that from a data point of view and evidence point of view, we're looking at if there's dumping, normal value calculations, so looking at whether or not the good is being sold more cheaply in the UK than it is in the exporting market. So we're looking at calculations around that, particularly if there is something which is called a particular market situation, which might look to kind of how to construct a normal value if that market is so distorted that those prices can't be used. And for subsidy, we're looking at the impact of the subsidy, the existence of the subsidy, the benefits that those subsidies convey onto that exporting producer. Then we're looking at the injury to the UK industry. So again, this is looking at the data from the UK industry itself to demonstrate that injury, showing things like price suppression or undercutting, things like that. And then whether or not that injury is caused by the dumping and or subsidy which is happening. So that's looking at other factors as well as those factors, but looking at other factors of what else is happening in the market, whether the data, what other data is available for what's happening in the market for that good. And actually, is there injury happening because of something else? So as you can see, as I say, it's demonstrating the very fundamentals of the case. It can also show the potential impact of introducing a measure and what that might have on the interested parties. And that can be a positive impact or it could be a negative impact. And that's why it's really, really important that we hear from people on the production side, but also from the importer side, downstream users, upstream users, and gather their data to really get a full picture of what's happening. As I say, it's vital to show that there is a basis for bringing an application. Pre-application officer will support and provide advice on whether or not that data is demonstrating that there is an indication that an investigation should take place or not. Because bringing an application, being involved in an investigation can be very resource intensive. It can place demands on people resource, also time resource. So it's really important that we look at the evidence which is available at the earliest opportunity and say, actually, this may not be the right remedy for you if you are looking at bringing an application. But also, as I say, throughout the life of the investigation, and you'll hear more about that from my colleagues very soon, but the data is the underpinning of the decisions that we make, as Way's already touched upon. We make decisions based on the evidence that we are provided with by interested parties. So we can only make decisions basically on the information that we've been sent. There is some research that we can do, but ultimately we have to make decisions based on the evidence that we are provided by those interested parties. So if we're missing some of that, then obviously the outcomes that we're going to come to aren't going to encompass all the potential sort of permutations of what there could be if we don't have everything that's out there. As it says there, if we don't receive this evidence in the form of data, we are missing that vital piece of the puzzle. So it's really important that people do engage, that people register and become involved in investigations which relate to goods which impact them or that they themselves are interested in, or not interested in, but are involved with, is what I'm looking for. So I'm going to pass across to Naomi now, who's going to take you through some information.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Naomi, a lead investigator here at the TRA. That means that I will basically lead a case team consisting of investigators, analysts, verification advisors, policy advisors, legal advisors as well, in order to deliver an investigation which results in making a recommendation to the Secretary of State saying we recommend a measure at whatever rate based on the data that we've got from you. So for now, I'm going to talk a bit about how we ask for that data. And we ask for data in a variety of different ways using a variety of different methods. These are tailored to the type of information that we're requesting and what we're going to be using it for. And so the way in which we ask for data depends on what type of party you are and what we need your data to do. So for domestic producers of the like goods and for exporters and importers of the goods concerned, in this case, we're looking for detailed cost and sales data because that's the data we're going to be using as the basis of calculations. We're also looking for qualitative information providing a narrative surrounding that. And so for these kinds of parties, we'll ask for data in the form of a questionnaire. And we'll also use a shorter questionnaire for other types of contributors, such as trade bodies. But in that case, we're not asking for detailed financial data. That's just the narrative side of things. These questionnaire templates are published to the case's public file, which means that they're publicly viewable, but we'll also issue them directly to parties that have registered to an investigation. The questionnaires are going to be marked with a deadline for completion, typically 4 weeks from when they're issued. We may be able to grant extensions if a party provides a reasonable request outlining why this is needed, but this is not a guarantee. It depends on the circumstances, both of the party making the request and of the investigation itself. And as Wei said right back at the beginning, we are looking to work efficiently and we do have timelines to consider and stick to. So we do really ask parties to make every effort to meet deadlines where possible. We're open to being contacted to help resolve questions and anything that comes up during the completion of the questionnaire to help you meet those deadlines as far as we can. But I think that's sort of it on timelines. I'm going to talk now a bit about what kind of data we're asking for within these questionnaires. So in the main questionnaire itself, we are asking for written responses providing qualitative information, as well as explanations of how the figures in the financial data provided have been arrived at. This is basically a chance to present your company's narrative of the events and also the chance to provide any explanations for anything that's unusual within that data. For example, if global events caused a drastic change in raw material prices from one year to the next, and that particularly impacted the company's costs and sales figures, then we'd like to know that because it enables us to interpret the data more appropriately. And there'll be a place in the questionnaire where there'll be a question that sort of asks for these kind of explanations that allow us to interpret the financial data in an appropriate way. We will also be asking producers, exporters, and importers to complete one or more questionnaire annexes, and those are Excel documents where we're asking for that quantitative financial data. That's going to include data on cost of production and transaction level sales data, and that forms the basis of our calculations. There's several places throughout the questionnaire and annexes where we're going to be asking for evidence to support the claims being made, or where it might be helpful to provide further information, such as a diagram or something to go alongside the written response to a question. Those can be provided as appendices, which can then be submitted along with that main questionnaire. The last thing I'm going to say about questionnaires is that we ask for a confidential and non-confidential version of all of the documents submitted, and we'll publish that non-confidential version to our public file, which means it's publicly viewable. That should redact any information you consider to be confidential, but still provide adequate information for a reader to understand in a general sense what has been provided. I'll come back to confidentiality a bit later on when talking about deficiencies, but for now I will hand over to Dan, who's going to talk a bit more about data.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan. I'm an analyst here at the TRA. The main role of an analyst is to perform the EIT, which is the economic interest test, which understands whether a trade measure is in the interest of the UK economy. As part of this, we ask up and downstream businesses and consumers to submit a business survey. This helps us understand what the decision making is of domestic businesses for the affected market. When you're submitting this survey, we'll ask you to write short written answers. This helps us to understand the qualitative decision making of the firms in the market, as this helps us inform the EIT. Additionally, there'll be multiple choice and data entry questions. This gives us quantitative data. This data is used in the EIT to understand the important economic factors behind the investigation. This takes into account things like firm costs, sales, employment, etc. within your firm. These questions are rooted. This means that if you are like an upstream business, for example, you will see only questions which are relevant to you. This helps us get the most accurate and relevant data for the investigation, but also saves us time with the analysis and you time when you're conducting it as well. I'll hand back to Naomi for the next part.
Okay, yes, so I think I said before I'll talk a bit more about confidentiality when I get to deficiencies, and now I'm going to do that and talk about these deficiencies. So this is mostly applicable to questionnaire submissions, and I guess first off, the question is what actually is a deficiency? It's basically any instance in which part of a submission is either incomplete or where the information supplied is deemed to be inadequate. Now, in practice, that can mean a variety of different things. Depending how you want to categorize it, there's either 2 or 3 main kinds of deficiency. The first of these is missing or incomplete information, and that's a deficiency in the full confidential submission. It basically means that the information is not provided sufficiently in a way that we can use in the way that we need to. So, for example, that could be a question that's just not been answered in the questionnaire. It could also be a question that isn't answered in enough detail to be useful, or where it's missing the required supporting documentation to back up the answer. Or it could be that that documentation has been provided, but just not in a way that we can actually use. So it could be provided in another language than English, or in a file format that we're not able to open. That kind of deficiency would also include if there is missing or incomplete information within the questionnaire annex. So that's the Excel document. And if there's some sections of that that just haven't been completed, or some cells in the spreadsheet that should have values in but have just been left blank, then that's also a deficiency. So I think that covers deficiencies in the sense of the information provided in the confidential submission being incomplete. The other kind of deficiency relates to the non-confidential submission. It's up to the party submitting the information to produce this non-confidential version of it, appropriately redacting and summarizing anything that's confidential. And there's 2 potential reasons why we might identify a deficiency here, namely over-redaction or under-redaction of information in this non-confidential version. Now, by under-redaction, which it sounds like, well, that's giving us too much information. How can that be a deficiency and incomplete information? But it does constitute a deficiency because under-redaction here means that confidential data such as personal information like names or phone numbers have been included in that submission. And because that sort of information is confidential by nature, we cannot publish that to our public file, so that under-redaction constitutes a deficiency. Over-redaction means the opposite, too much of the information being redacted, but without sufficient explanation or justification. We understand that there is information you'll consider to be confidential because it's commercially sensitive data, but where you do redact that sort of information, we need that summary of what that redacted information consists of. So that could take the form of providing figures, but as a range rather than the absolute value, or by giving a high-level explanation of what that redacted information relates to. If you don't provide that summary adequately, then that constitutes a deficiency. And I will say at this point that in exceptional circumstances where it's not possible to provide any kind of meaningful non-confidential summary, we can also accept a statement of reasons. And that's basically, that needs to outline the reasons for these exceptional circumstances and why, in this instance, the information cannot be summarized in a non-confidential way. So that's what deficiencies are. But the other question here is, why do they actually matter? Well, I think hopefully it's clear by now that we're not just asking for your information for the sake of it. We're requesting this information so that we can use it to inform decision-making in the investigation. Any missing or incomplete information negatively impacts our ability to make those informed decisions. And frankly, it's in your interest to make sure we can use your information because your information gives your version of events. Obviously, that's going to apply if there's completeness deficiencies where you've not given us information we've requested. But confidentiality deficiencies are also really important because having that adequate non-confidential summary of the information is important for us to be able to use it in reports to back up our conclusions. As an organization, we have the right to disregard any information if it's not adequately summarized and where no statement of reasons is provided. So that means that these kinds of deficiencies do also impact how we may use your data. And in this case, we can instead fall back on something called facts available, which just means filling in the gaps in the information using other sources. And I won't dwell on that too much, but I will just reiterate here that this means that it really is generally going to be in your interest to ensure that we can use your information. I think the last thing I'll say quickly on deficiencies is that if a submission to us does contain any deficiencies, then we will issue something called a deficiency notice, which outlines what those are and what we'd like you to do to address those deficiencies. You've then got the chance to resubmit with the changes made. We will aim to make ourselves available for discussion during that period if anything is unclear, to help understand what we're asking of you and to help get those deficiencies resolved. So I think that is all I had to say on deficiencies. I'll now pass over to Margaret, who's going to talk about verifying the data.
Thank you. My name is Margaret Shitu. I'm a lead verification advisor. As a lead verification advisor, we lead verification activities, and what verification entails is what I'll be talking about. I'm an accountant by profession, so the verifications advisors at the TRA are all accountants. Talking about verification, verification is the process of assessing the data provided to the TRA for completeness, relevance, and accuracy. These three criteria gives us a reasonable level of assurance that over the data and that we may be able to rely on the data. To obtain assurance on completeness of the data, we check that you have included all the data that is required for our analysis and nothing has been left out. In checking for relevance, we aim to ensure that the data you submit is useful to the investigation, and we check for accuracy, which entails verifying supporting evidence to assure ourselves that the data is free from any error or misstatements. The outcome of this determines how we may use your data for the case decisions. Each investigation at the TRA that we encounter is different, whether it's the type of case or complexity of the interested parties or the products involved. So as such, we design our verification activities to be proportionate and ensure that our activities that are underpinned by strategic documentation, and we try to focus on risk. So the procedures we adopt in verifying data will vary depending on our risk assessments of the data and how it may be used for analysis. The procedures we adopt to verify data include planning our verification activities by familiarizing ourselves with the business at a transactional level. This entails observing the accounting systems as part of our walkthrough process to determine the reliability of the systems from which the data submitted in the questionnaires have been produced. As part of this, sometimes we may visit your premises, and where it's not possible to visit your premises, we may conduct these activities remotely. We also reconcile the data to your financial statements and other reliable sources. For examples, we may look at your ledgers, trial balances, Sometimes we may ask for your management accounts, whatever source that we can depend on to provide sufficient evidence. We analyze the data to understand the trends and may pick outliers for further testing. We then trace transactions to source documents like invoices, payment evidence, or purchase agreements, sales agreements, delivery notes. The type of evidence we rely on depends on how what our risk assessments at the planning stage, what we've observed from the risk assessment at the planning stage, and our understanding of your accounting system based on the walkthrough that we conduct at the planning stage. We also rework and recalculate some of the figures you give us to ensure that they are accurate and we can rely on them. I'll hand over back to Naomi. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. So yeah, at this point, I guess we've covered how we ask for your data, why it's important that that data doesn't contain deficiencies, and how we check the accuracy of that data through verification activities. I guess the next question is, now we've got all that data, now we've done all of that, what do we actually use that data for? How do we use your data? I guess at a really high level, we use the information you provide in order to inform case decision making, and that is to determine the outcome of the investigation. So by the outcome of the investigation, what I mean is both whether a measure is recommended and what form that measure takes. We use the quantitative financial data submitted by producers, exporters, and possibly also importers in order to do calculations of the margins. So that's a dumping or a subsidy margin, which represents the level of dumping and or subsidization of the imports of the goods concerned, and also an injury margin, which represents the amount of injury that those imports are causing to the UK industry. For these calculations, we are looking at cost, sales, and profit data during the period of investigation, which is a 1-year period of time. We use this data at PCN level, that's short for product control number, and basically each PCN designates a specific subcategory of the goods that we're investigating and enables us to ensure that we are really comparing like with like when comparing UK produced and imported goods within the calculations. We'll calculate a dumping or subsidy margin and also an injury margin, and then whichever of those is lower will then inform the level of duty that we recommend. This approach basically ensures that we don't recommend a measure that exceeds the actual amount of dumping or subsidization that occurs, but also that we don't recommend a measure that exceeds the injury that those imports are causing to the UK industry without that measure in place. We also use higher level quantitative data from producers relating to a 4-year injury period in order to inform our injury and causation assessment, and that's used alongside the qualitative information provided by all parties in the main questionnaire. This injury and causation assessment, is a key part of the investigation because it establishes whether the UK industry is suffering injury, so that's the injury part, and also then the causation part of that is whether this injury can be attributed to imports of the goods concerned. That's really important because in order to recommend a measure in place against these goods, we need to be able to see that the UK industry is actually being injured, as well as to demonstrate that it is these imports of the goods concerned which are causing that injury. So in that assessment, we are looking at the information submitted by domestic producers in the questionnaire, as well as trends in certain key economic indicators across that 4-year injury period. We're also considering information submitted by importers and exporters to understand the role that the imported goods are playing in impacting domestic industry. We'll combine that with other sources of information, such as import data from HMRC, and we'll also consider any other relevant factors which could have impacted the industry during that injury period. So, for example, in recent investigations, the effect of COVID has been a really important consideration. And, well, if you look back to the last few years, just take my word for it, interpreting trends in data over a 4-year period that's included things like Brexit, COVID, and a year in which inflation rates hit a 41-year high. It's certainly been an interesting challenge to understand those trends. And as a sort of side note to this, This is why it's really important that you give us as much narrative as possible around the figures provided, because that helps us to understand what's going on, especially when it's a complicated period of time. So if the injury and causation assessment is indicative that there is material injury or threat of that material injury resulting from imports of the goods concerned, then provided that the economic interest test or EIT is also passed, which Dan's going to talk about a little bit more in a minute, then in that case, we would look to recommend the implementation of measures at a level as defined by those calculations of the margins. So I'll now pass over to Dan, who's going to talk a bit more about data for the EIT.
Thank you, Naomi. Yeah, so the EIT is a test which determines whether the introduction of a new trade remedy measure is in the overall economic interest of the UK. So this takes into account many factors. Firstly, how it will impact the overall health of the UK economy. But it also looks at smaller factors such as geographic impacts. Is there any particular area or demographic impacts? Is there any particular group of people which will be disproportionately affected with the introduction of a trade remedy measure? So obviously data is the main driver behind doing this analysis. But we don't only use your data. As Naomi expanded on, we use many sources. We use HMRC import data. We also use sources like Dun & Bradstreet as well. These are used in scenarios such as competition analysis. This is looking at the state of the UK domestic market, and it uses the HMRC data to look at what firms are importing of the light good, and it uses your submitted production data to see what you're producing. So then we have an understanding of what is the overall trade within the UK market, and we can analyze whether competition will be affected with the introduction of a trade measure. Additionally, the geographical impacts. This uses the employment statistics submitted by you in the business survey, but also it uses local firm data from sources like Dun & Bradstreet. This will give us a much better understanding of what the likely geographic impact of a trade remedy measure would be. I will now hand back to Georgie to conduct the end of this.
Thank you very much, Dan, and to the rest of the panel for giving us that very highly informative webinar. We have received some questions in the chat, which I will ask you all, and just, yeah, whoever feels most fit to answer it, just go ahead. So our first question is, do you receive data that has been falsified, for example, from overseas companies wanting to play down the level of subsidization they receive from their governments?
Okay, well, if no one else is going to come in, I'll take this. I guess we receive information from a variety of different parties who we understand are going to have a variety of different motivations for submitting that information, different perspectives on things. And we don't just take the information that's submitted to us at face value. This is why we conduct verification. We have certainly had instances where we've had two different parties registered to the same investigation, providing conflicting information or information that appears to contradict each other, whether or not either side is necessarily falsified information or just selectively chosen different parts of information. But this is the whole purpose behind why we verify the data that we're given, and we will aim to make sure that we are confident in the data that we're using through these verification activities.
Can I also add, sorry, as part of the verification activities, we try to obtain as much evidence as possible. And part of that is to ensure that we are not obtaining falsified data. So we are not only relying on evidence provided by the IP, we are also looking beyond evidence provided by the IP to ensure that we do not obtain falsified information. Sometimes IP make errors because of understanding of what we request for and how they want it presented. But we try to identify all of that at the verification stage. Some other things that we also try to do is where we do not have absolute confidence in the data, we include that in the verification reports, that we may not be able to rely on that data. Thank you.
And just from me is that we have to run investigations based on good faith. So that both parties are coming from this from an angle of trust. So we want to cultivate as an organization that trust, in that we're taking people's arguments, people's perspectives seriously, and we encourage that. But I think, to quote, I can't remember who said this, but trust but verify. I think that's our motto here, is that we do a lot of verification. It's not just, we just take things on face value, but there is a certain element of trust that we place in our stakeholders to kind of tell us the truth. We obviously, I think Naomi mentioned very clearly that at the beginning is that there is a motivational issue here. So we have to look into that. It's not that people give us falsified information, it's that they have a very specific perspective in which that information is provided to us. So yeah, I think we verify, but it has to be done on trust.
Thank you very much, Naomi, Margaret, and Wei. Some very good answers there. Another question has come in, that is, how do you temper an ADD when the product can only be sold in 2 markets and only one is injured?
I feel like that's a Naomi answer, but I don't want to put you on the spot there.
Yeah, it probably is. So was the question, how do you temper basically an anti-dumping duty when a product can only be sold in 2 markets? What was this, the last part of it?
But then only one market is injured. So out of the 2 markets, only one of them is injured.
So we're saying, how do we temper an anti-dumping duty when
the
so the
product can be
exporter
sold
is
in 2 markets, but one of them
the
is injured
exporting
and one of
market
them is.
and the UK, and only the UK is claiming injury
I think
from
so,
this? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess the point here is that what we are doing is we are using the information provided in order to calculate margins. If the product is only being sold on these 2 markets, then what we'll calculate, say, so a dumping margin and an injury margin. The dumping margin has nothing necessarily to do with the injury going on in the UK. That is to do with what's the difference between what companies in the exporting country are selling the product for domestically versus on the export market. And sure, that's going to be impacted by whether or not there are other countries that they can export to. But that's not a relevant consideration in our investigation. The important thing is it being sold much cheaper on the export market than it's being sold domestically in the country? Because that is then the company dumping the product. And if it's causing injury to the UK industry, then that will come out in the injury margin. We'll construct a target price for the UK industry. So that means that we are not getting results that are skewed by the effects of injury, because the target price is the price that the product would be being sold for in the UK in the absence of that injury, using a reasonable level of profit that would expect companies to make in the absence of being injured. I'm not sure if I've really answered the question there, but I think basically we are using the evidence provided to get the best answers that we can, given whatever circumstances we are in, and that is the best that we can do.
Thank you very much for that, Naomi. Did anyone else want to come in, or I think that covered it quite nicely? No. Okay. So next question we have received is, someone said, really interesting thinking about how to get this complex information. Has there been any user research into the factors that contribute to deficiencies? Is it users misunderstanding the question, not having the information, or deliberately withholding the information?
I can speak from a pre-application kind of point of view, if you like, around application forms and things like that, which is obviously it's relatively new that the industry are having to engage with trade remedies for a lot of industries. And so looking particularly to bring applications and things, it's very it can be quite jargon heavy. So the questions can be quite complicated. The level of information, the detail of information that we need can be quite granular. So that can be quite off-putting, or it can just be quite confusing. And also when thinking about things like looking at normal value in the exporting market, a lot of that information isn't out there. So at the application stage, it can be very tricky to get the information that we need, or people just don't know or really understand what we're looking for. And that's what pre-application office is trying to address or help with. But what I would say is that at application stage, we are looking for what's reasonably available to the applicant. So it's what's publicly available and what do they have access to, but it still has to be enough to demonstrate that all of those fundamentals to bring a case that we spoke about earlier. So I think it's a mixture of things, but I think that primarily at application stage, it's about trying to understand what we're looking for and how we're looking for it to be presented, and also, you know, how best to get that information, because it's just not necessarily available always.
Yeah, so I can come in a little bit more on a sort of questionnaire deficiencies as well. I think it's kind of similar. Sometimes it is a case of parties not quite understanding what we've asked for. And I think that's something that we are still learning as an organization. We're going through a project to sort of rethink about how we structure these questionnaires, to continue thinking about simplifying this and making it easier to understand, to improve this process. Often it's things being left blank without an explanation is a big one. So to say everything I'm going to say here is basically anecdotal, based on what I've seen on cases, but it's a sort of thing I think a lot of the time where the number that would go in a box would be 0, but that box has just been left blank. We don't know if that was meant to be a 0 or if it just wasn't filled in. And I think that's probably the thing we see the most of. But yeah, we do also get parties deliberately withholding information, but not in an obstructive way, more in they're not necessarily comfortable giving that information in the non-confidential version, and we have to work with parties to explain what we're doing with that data, what we need from them as a summary of it if they can't provide the data itself. And I think it's a combination of different factors, but yeah, hopefully that sort of answers it a bit.
Thank you very much, both. I think that was a great question and good answers as well. Another question we've got is, have you found it easier to obtain or verify data to support higher dumping margins than it is to support higher subsidy margins?
I can come in. When we plan verification, we plan it based on risk assessment. So the approach to verifying dumping is different from our approach to verifying subsidies, because the sort of data we'll be looking at will be different. And we always ask IPs to provide as much evidence as possible. So because there are two different types of cases, the approach is definitely different. I wouldn't say that one has more difficulty over the other.
And I guess maybe this is a very political answer to the question, is that the role of the Trade Remedies Authority is very much to put in a measure which brings up prices to the internationally competitive level. So we're here to protect the UK industries, but we're also not here just purely just putting measures for the sake of putting in measures. So we will put in measures which will bring prices up to the internationally competitive level. We want to make sure there is reduced injury to the market, but but what we wouldn't do is to say, okay, we'll just slap a measure on a certain good because we can. So the evidence and the data has to allow us to make those necessary recommendations to Secretary of State. If the evidence doesn't let us do that, then we won't make those recommendations to Secretary of State. Obviously, this is a little bit more complex in the background, but that's kind of a high level. That's kind of how we approach these questions. So, to answer the question, is it easier? Sometimes, but that's not necessarily how we approach the question of our recommendations to put when we put in a measure.
Great, thank you very much. The next question we've got is the EIT considered passed or failed by an estimated absolute pound value, or is it balanced judgment across the affected groups or industry?
Dan, do you want to give that a go, or do you want me to respond to that one?
Yeah, I'd rather Wei answers.
Right. So it is very much a number of factors. So we try to quantify the economic value or the economic impact of each of our measures as much as possible. So when we look at things like injury, competition analysis, or where there is a feasibility for us to quantify it, we will, as a good economist should do. But that said, certain elements of the work that we do sometimes can't be quantified in such a straightforward way. So, say, for example, geographical impact. So, if we put in the measure, is it going to have a damaging impact on a specific part of the country, or if a measure goes in and it has a impact on specific elements of, say, society. So, protected characteristics is an example here. But also, and as as we're here talking today, is that sometimes it is very much difficult for us to get the information that we need in order to quantify things. So it's not an absolute value. Where we will quantify it, but it is a holistic view of the economy as a whole, and it's not a simple tick, 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 therefore it's passed. It's very much looking across the piece. But also there is an element of, what are the broader economic conditions across the country and what's the economic goals of the current government. We have to consider those things as well as we make a recommendation. But we do have a specific number of factors which we'll have to look at.
Thanks very much, Wei. We have another question which asks, in general, is there any retention policy of holding the non-confidential data as it's not published?
We do have a policy. It is in our privacy notices, and we do have a data retention policy as well. I'm going to apologize. I cannot remember that off the top of my head exactly what that is. If my colleagues on the call do know, please do shout out. But it is published as part of our TRS privacy notice, and you should be able to find that on our homepage. If you cannot, please do let us know, and we'll grab that for you. But I guess kind of just on top of that is that the retention policy will differ depending on the data that we're collecting. So say, for example, most data that we get for investigations will have the same retention policy. But if you're providing data to us, say, for example, a survey or could be engaging with our key stake or part of our stakeholder survey, that will have a different retention policy and a different retention date. So please do keep an eye out for that in our privacy notices.
Great, thanks, Wei. We've had quite a few questions. Another one is, what level of support do you offer to smaller businesses who perhaps don't have the resources or the time to trawl through loads of data to find out what they need to submit?
Yep, so I think there's a couple of aspects to this. Pre-application office is here to advise and sort of direct you to the types of things that you'll need to submit, and we'll check application forms and provide feedback on those to kind of guide, what further information is needed or types of information that's needed to support any application that's being brought, or answer any questions that you might have around the regime or the type of data you might be looking to bring. But ultimately, we can't go and find that evidence for industry. It's the industry's case to bring. They are the experts in their field, and they know what's happening and all of that. So it's very much for the business to bring that case and bring that evidence to us. As I say, we can provide guidance around what we're looking for and the types of things that we're looking for and how that needs to be submitted.
Thanks very much, Sarah. We had actually a follow-up on one of the questions we asked at the start, which was to you, Naomi. The original question was, how do you temper an anti-dumping duty when the products can be sold in two markets? I think potentially between us, you might have understood it a bit wrong. But I think what was meant was when the UK imports, and there are two markets in the UK for the imported product, when market A is in the UK is injured as there is a UK production and market B isn't injured as there is no UK production. Applying an anti-dumping duty across both will harm UK market B as it will increase the price to market B consumers. I don't know if I've said that very well. Does that make any sense?
No, it kind of does. I think depends what we're talking about here, because if we're talking about like two different downstream uses of the same product, then that really falls under the economic interest test more than it falls under sort of the question of injury itself. And that will be considered how a measure will have impact on everybody that is affected by it. And if the negative impacts on one part of industry massively outweigh the positive impacts on other parts of industry, then that's the sort of situation where we might expect something to fail the economic interest test because it's not in the interests of the UK economy as a whole. So from an injury margin perspective itself, if we're talking about two different sort of categories of things that fall under the same scope of a measure, and we're saying, well, it impacts one and not the other within the UK, that's the point at which, when we are doing the calculations, because we're doing stuff at the level of PCNs, we've split the products down into very precise categories. We're comparing like with like. So we're in the calculations, only the things that are the same things, the same subcategory of things as those that are being imported, are being directly compared to come up with the numbers that affect our measures. We also do have the power to sort of look at the scope of measures if it turns out that we think there is merit in changing the sort of the scope from what has been sort of put forward in an application or what falls under sort of the commodity codes as they exist. We can consider that as part of it and say, well, should we just be applying a measure to a certain part of this and not all of it? That's something that we do have the power to do when it's relevant. I hope that I have gone some way towards answering the question a bit better now.
And just to add from the economic interest test perspective, I think this is very much something that we do look at from the data that we collect. So we tend to put out the questionnaires on upstream and downstream impacts to the businesses affected kind of by the import measures. We also look more kind of horizontally now through a separate survey in which we look at consumers as well. We also look at kind of other affected businesses. So it's an opportunity for those businesses to engage and tell us actually we are a big importer of, say, good X in which we're putting a measure in. So we do, and again, it's a holistic look at the market between market A and market B. Obviously, kind of what Naomi's saying there is that if a market is significantly bigger compared to the market which, say, there is injury, for example, then we need to look and say kind of what the scale of that market is, how that market is affecting kind of other industries across the UK, and then make a judgment off the back of that. There is guidance that we follow, but it's not a computer says yes or computer says no situation. It's very much looking holistically across the piece to understand what the market situation is and then make a decision off the back of that. But like I said earlier, we try to be as open and transparent about how we make those decisions. So especially around economic interest tests, where we are using a lot of publicly available information, we'll usually source that so you can see how we come to that conclusion.
Great, thank you very much both. I think those are all the questions that we've got in the chat. If anyone else has any questions later on or after the webinar, please send all your questions to events@traderemedies.gov.uk and we can get them answered to you. Thank you all again for coming. You will find a recording of this webinar on our YouTube account very soon. I hope you have enjoyed what we've been talking about. I'll also be sending round a feedback form about the webinar very shortly, and if you have a chance to fill it out, we would love to hear your feedback. But yeah, I think once again, thank you very much for coming and listening to what we had to say. Have a lovely festive period, everyone, and goodbye from the TRA.